Our first afternoon speaker is Kasey Moran, a PhD candidate in Dr. John Richardson Future Waters Research Excellence Lab at the University of British Columbia. Kasey's work focuses on the effects of river diking and channelization on cottonwood forest structure and dynamics in the semi-arid Okanagan-Smilkameen region of British Columbia. We're excited that Kasey can join us today to discuss opportunities to advance diverse objectives through riparian restoration monitoring. And with that, I'll turn over to Kasey to start your presentation. Thank you.
Hi there, it's nice to see everybody today. I'm calling in from beautiful Dunblane, Scotland, right near the River Allen. But my home and my research are all carried out in Seal territory in the Okanagan-Smilkameen region, British Columbia. And I've changed the title of my talk to reflect my humility here today. So from advancing diverse objectives in riparian monitoring to a Cottonwood ecologist take on riparian restoration monitoring. I thought it was a bit too cocky of me to say that we will be advancing objectives here today. Anyways, so we're going to go through a quick outline of cottonwood ecology and threats, because I know that most of the people on the line are probably more, fish people looking at restoring fish habitat. Just mention some few common restoration actions taken with respect to cottonwood. List a few monitoring protocols and their associated limitations. And then I'll sort of put forward a few ideas to address those limitations. Okay, so cottonwood. This is a beautiful cottonwood forest in the Smilkameen River in Coston. Cottonwood is a foundation species, meaning that the forests that it's the sort of dominant species within support an environmentally and biologically unique ecosystem, unlike anything else in the landscape. They create these lovely climatically temperate wildlife corridors, not only for aquatic species, but also for terrestrial species. In the Okanagan and other semi-arid regions, they're very spatially restricted to the margins of lakes and streams because of their requirement for year-round access to groundwater. And they're a pioneer species, so they're adapted to floodplain habitat, and that includes a flood disturbance regime. They're also very poor competitors and shade intolerant. So as ecologists, we think about cottonwood as our selected species, meaning that they produce a very large amount of seed, of tiny, tiny little poorly provisioned seeds. The seed release coincides with the peak of the spring flood. And when the seedlings germinate, their roots have to grow fast enough to stay in contact with that receding water table, otherwise they desiccate and die. And that's the major cause of death for cottonwood seedlings in any given year. Because they're so tiny, the seeds have a very short viability period, only about 2 weeks after they're released, and so you won't find any viable cottonwood seeds present in soil seed banks. Like beavers, we can think about cottonwood as an ecosystem engineer, and that's because it can build its own nursery habitat by trapping sediment. So there's an idea that vegetated islands and bars and rivers are part of cottonwood's extended phenotype, meaning that sort of like beaver meadows, you don't get these fluvial landforms necessarily in the same way if you don't have cottonwood. And that's known as the fluvial biogeomorphological successional model. Cottonwood is also capable of a variety of vegetative reproductive pathways in addition to seedling establishment. So those things include root suckering, coppicing, branch propagation, platyptosis, which is branches that are sacrificed from trees taking root, and flood training. So when trees are pushed over, they send their branches up skyward to be new shoots. We typically associate cottonwood forests with a certain type of river. we think about wide alluvial valleys, a shallow water table, very good surface groundwater connectivity, dynamic floodplains, meandering or multi-channel planforms, lateral migration of the river, sediment movement, bars and islands, abandoned channels, scroll bars, oxbows, and natural or naturalized flow regimes to coincide with the seed release and root growth phenology of Cottonwood. So in other words, they really do depend on complex and dynamic riverscapes. So they're not just trees that you can plant along the river and have them function as normal. They're really integrated into these very complicated moving systems. So in the Okanagan-Similkameen region, there's some literature that suggests that Cottonwood, in the Similkameen was associated with sort of the bottomland large river, but within the Okanagan, where it's more of a chain of lakes, a lot of the Cottonwood seems to have been associated with tributaries, which is kind of interesting. So I'm going to kind of walk you through some of the relationships between Cottonwood and rivers that you may want to think about if you're working on like a process-based restoration project. So you've got your spring flood. The water comes down from the hill slopes, eroding sediment, transporting it, eroding it from stream banks, both coarse and fine sediment. Sediment is deposited and trapped on the riverbed. Large wood is often involved in trapping the sediment. That creates fluvial landforms like bars and islands that are then scoured by more moving sediment. The scour also applies to trees that are already established, which causes root suckering to occur. And if it pushes trees over, then you end up with flood training. If branches break off, then they can take root and you get branch propagation. And if you lose a tree trunk and all of that, but the roots stay in situ, then you end up with coppicing. When the flood peaks, that's when you have the seed release. The seeds rain down through the air and then float down the river until they find a piece of bare alluvial sediment where they germinate. As the flood recedes, the root growth again has to keep pace with the receding water table, otherwise desiccation occurs. Or if they germinate too low, then they drown or they're scoured away. So in most years, the mortality rate is extremely high for seedlings. And it seems that it's probably at least a 5-year return interval flood that causes effective disturbance to create these sort of bare fluvial landforms that constitute good cottonwood nursery habitat. But then following that flood, you need maybe 2 to 3 years of lower to moderate floods for those seedlings to be able to establish enough to survive subsequent spring floods. So these might be a few things that you could think about if you're working on process-based restoration projects. These relationships, it's the relationships between Cottonwood and the river that I really want to emphasize today. They're not just trees. They're in relationship with the river. So this is the Okanagan River near Oliver, and I think it really illustrates a lot of the threats to cottonwood in the region. So rivers that are straightened, laterally confined, deeply incised so that the water table starts to drop, that have disconnected and developed floodplains, that have armored stream banks, a sediment starvation, either because of dams or maybe sediment capture basins, really static floodplain conditions, or highly managed flow regimes that don't coincide with cottonwood phenology and growth. Those are the major threats being faced by cottonwood. So just to kind of summarize, really simplified and static riverscapes. I'm going to take you on a quick tour of some of the cottonwood habitats in the Okanagan, where I'm from. So this is Penticton Creek in Penticton. This stream was channelized. It has attenuated flows due to a reservoir in the headwaters. It's basically a concrete flume in a lot of places, although it has been restored along some reaches, and there's a plan going forward for it. Urban encroachment is quite extreme into the riparian zone. There's competing species, including invasives like Siberian elm. And so what we end up with is sort of these somewhat older, but very just stressed out looking trees, a couple of root suckers if you're lucky, absolutely no seedling recruitment, and no large wood, because any wood that falls into the stream has to be removed to prevent damage to downstream infrastructure. So this type of stream, really, there's no future for cottonwood without restoration. Pardon me. So this is Ellis Creek, also in Penticton. It's also been channelized, has attenuated flows. It's sediment starved because of a diversion further upstream. There's stream bank erosion that's causing mature cottonwoods to be lost. The channel's incised. It's laterally confined. And so there's a few stressed trees. There might be a couple of seedlings, but the substrate is too coarse to allow for seedling establishment. There's some root suckering. That's really the only reproductive pathway along a creek like this. And again, any large wood that falls into the stream is removed. So it's losing its already limited reproductive capacity through the loss of mature trees. This is the Okanagan River near Oliver. It's been diked and channelized. It has these very artificial, highly managed flows that don't coincide with cottonwood phenology. It's been straightened. The floodplain is completely disconnected and non-functional. The channel is laterally confined. There's a low sediment load, partly because of the lakes, which are natural, but also because of dams and sediment catchment, basins to control sediment coming in from tributaries. There are no fluvial landforms within the river. And there's a law that says that you have to keep cottonwood off of the dike. So it has no chance in this system. There's a few older trees growing in behind the dike that probably established around the time the dike was built. If you do get any seedlings, they can't compete with the grass growing on the dike. You might get a couple of root suckers as a result of mowing, but again, no large wood. So there are both legislative and physical barriers to restoring the relationships between cottonwood and the river in this case. Here's a spot along the Okanagan River where there's been some effort made to restore floodplain connectivity through dike setback. But there's still the problem of artificial and highly managed flows. And at the time when I took this photo, the floodplain was still disconnected because of its elevation relative to the river channel. Again, there's a low sediment load, so there's no scour of competing vegetation. And so you get lots of competing vegetation. So we've got some older, stressed out looking trees, a few snags, maybe a couple of seedlings, but they probably won't survive because of the location of the water table, and a couple of root suckers. So there's really still a lack of functional connectivity in this system. And then here's a weird one, Mission Creek in Kelowna. This area has been diked and channelized as well. The floodplain is disconnected. The river's been straightened and laterally confined. There are no fluvial landforms in this reach. And but the difference between this and the Okanagan River, one of the differences is that there's a much higher sediment load. So there's all these coarse substrates that can scour the inside of the dike. And cottonwood is allowed to grow on the dike here. So you have these older trees in behind the dike. You've got some seedlings that can actually establish once in a while on the dike because it's being scoured of competing vegetation. And you get root suckers stimulated by mowing and scouring. but still you don't really have any large wood because it has to be removed from the system. But sites like this are interesting. To me, it kind of suggests that maybe sediment scour is important, and obviously vegetation management policy is really important too. So some common restoration actions that are taken for cottonwood include just direct planting without any sort of thought to the habitat. You might have urban stream restoration, which can sometimes just look like landscaping or gardening. Bioengineering, some people use cottonwood to help stabilize stream banks, although willow is more common. Dike setback projects start to get at reconnecting habitat. Floodplain reconnection is sort of a step above that. Maybe you do some remeandering of the river. You can design environmental flows to coincide with cottonwood phenology. You may reconnect tributaries, so take out those sort of sediment catchment basins and allow that sediment to enter the main stem. And if you can't do that, you can just directly augment sediment. So some of these are more superficial than others. But anyhow, those are the sort of main, some of the main types of restoration associated with cottonwood. So I don't want to get too much into this because I'm not the one necessarily doing the monitoring, but in the morning session, one of the presenters said that monitoring is for learning. And definitely it is, but I also have a few other suggestions. You may just want to declare victory or defeat. I think it's really important to do monitoring so that you get to go out on the land. As scientists, often we do a lot of our work at the desk, so this is an opportunity to participate in on-the-land learning. Engaging with community. I've been involved in a lot of projects where volunteers from the community come out and help. You may want to improve techniques and outcomes, contribute to research or the technical or academic literature, just share experiences out in the field, maybe create a professional portfolio with photos of your work, and maybe you're mainly meeting reporting requirements. So what do we measure when we do cottonwood plantings? Well, you may want to just look at survival of the individual plants that you put into the ground and or growth. I suggest it's probably also a good idea, if you can, to try to relate survival and growth to things like individual plant characteristics. Did you plant, large 5-gallon pot type cottonwoods, or did you just take cuttings straight from the field and stick them in the dirt? Key environmental variables like depth to groundwater is a really important one. Site preparation methods, so whether you were making the ground rough and loose, whether you were adding in some kind of mycorrhizal addition or a mulch. Other treatments might include things like herbivore exclusion cones or irrigation. And maybe some disturbance indicators are useful as well. If you get a herd of cattle coming in, that's good to note in your monitoring report. The individual plants can be the focal point in planting projects, but they don't have to be. You can use more area-based measurements if you like. If you're doing habitat restoration, then you may want to look at things like seedling recruitment or tree cover within the restored habitat. And it would be good to try and relate those again to key environmental variables, maybe site preparation methods. And in this case, maybe some kind of indicator of floodplain connectivity, like the period and depth of inundation, or maybe sediment scour and deposition. These measurements might be more area-based. You might make use of photographic series or GIS tools, as opposed to looking at individual plants. So what do we learn from project-based monitoring when it comes to riparian projects? You can learn how the interventions that you perform translate into living trees and restored habitat area. So for example, these are from some projects that I looked at where we compared unrooted and rooted cuttings, survival over time, or seedlings versus cuttings, etc. They allow you to, hope to repeat your successes and avoid losses and inefficiencies, while revealing maybe new or ongoing threats, helping you to identify potential adaptive management actions, and maybe even develop some guidelines and best practices. But there are limitations associated with just monitoring one project at a time. Obviously, it provides you with a limited amount of data. And unfortunately, with planting projects, mortality rates can be extremely high. So if 95% of your plants die in the first year, you really haven't learned very much from that. Monitoring periods are too short, especially if you're thinking about habitat creation type of restoration projects, because of the fact that you may have to wait for a 5 to 10 year flood followed by 2 moderate flows to get any kind of recruitment. You could be waiting decades. So monitoring periods of around 5 years, as I think was suggested by one of the folks in the last in the morning session, it's just too short for these restoring these systems. And as a result, results from a single year can appear really idiosyncratic. And furthermore, if you're reporting your results out of context with respect to the ecological drivers outside of the scope of your restoration works that control things like seedling recruitment, you may not be getting any kind of understanding of how what you did fits into that broader picture. And of course, there's always capacity limitations when you're monitoring. So you may just not have time to sort of do these sort of value-added things with monitoring, adding more complicated analyses or adding time onto the monitoring period. I think that the way to address some of these limitations is through collaboration between restoration practitioners and researchers. So some of the things that we could do together are to develop and test restoration techniques based on ecological models and theories, and I'll get into a little bit more detail on this. We can articulate research questions together that combine restoration challenges with research interests. We can conduct meta-analyses and correct bias in the scientific literature. We can co-develop relevant and practical monitoring techniques for more complex patterns or processes that ecologists might be interested in, but that might not be on the radar of restoration practitioners. And conveniently, we can exchange ideas while the projects are ongoing. So you don't have to wait for our peer-reviewed publications to come out. And we get to access sites that we may have to wait, a couple of years until you're through with them to have any input. So here's an example of a restoration technique based on an ecological model. So Stuart Rood's recruitment box model and his idea of effective disturbance, Rood and others, kind of postulates that you can predict an elevational band within a floodplain where you're very likely to be able to get cottonwood seedling recruitment. So that's based on some hydrological characteristics. You can use that information to design your dike setback and floodplain connectivity project. And then you can combine that with the idea of effective disturbance, where that area needs to be scoured free of competing vegetation to predict like small sites, even within your restored area where you can expect to see seedlings. So this is the restoration or recruitment box model in a bit more detail. So it combines information of seed release and viability period with the fact that the root growth rate has to keep pace with stage recession. And so that gives you a period of time when you can expect recruitment to occur. And then spatially, you've got the thickness of the capillary fringe, which is sort of the wet soil above the water table. And you add that to the amount of root growth you can expect in a year to get the uppermost elevational boundary of recruitment. And then the lowermost boundary is controlled by base flow river stage plus the area that's scoured in wintertime. So you can use this model to design environmental flows, your dike setback and floodplain reconnection project, and then you could also monitor and report things like seedling recruitment within this expected area. And definitely models like this require testing in different environmental contexts. So another idea that we could look at together is, the environmental conditions that drive natural recruitment pulses also determine survival rates of plantings. So if you give us your reference site monitoring data, as long as you're measuring the sizes of individual plants, we can create these size distributions. We can identify recruitment pulses and gaps and put that together with root growth rates to come up with timing of when recruitment pulses and bad years for cottonwood occurred. And we can compare that then to your records of planting projects to see if there's overlap. You can also use these types of plots to figure out where good reference areas might be and where maybe habitats that are in trouble and should be prioritized for restoration might be. You can try and figure out how long you'll have to wait until you might detect a success. Or you can try and decide whether you need to plant once or distribute planting over several years to sort of hedge your bets against this environmental variability. So I won't go into this too much because Karen did this morning, but one restoration project is basically just a single data point. And so we need lots of data points in order to understand the amount of variability in these systems. We need to know about failures because those definitely represent critical data points, but often aren't widely reported, and that results in bias in the scientific literature. And then if you can put your data point into context, that might suggest adaptive management options and or sort of reveal competing objectives or design limitations. This is the area that I think is really interesting where we can connect together. So there's complex patterns and concepts and processes that ecologists get really nerdy and excited about, like ecosystem engineering, fluvial biogeomorphological succession, positive niche construction, extended phenotypes, hydraulic redistribution, all these weird, patterns and processes that you may not care about, but that we could potentially either put on your radar, or you could help us to collect data for, or we could help you to collect data for it. Anyway, it's a sort of there's possibly a mutually beneficial relationship there. Maybe coming from the salmon side of things like cross-ecosystem subsidies, food web dynamics, trophic cascades, critical habitat provision, and maybe even traditional human uses will appeal to you more. And then this is my sort of final thought, which is that I think that monitoring needs to be reframed as a community engaged process that happens over a long period of time. As I said, monitoring a long-lived species, you can't just do it for a year or two. You have to keep going back. And I think that the responsibility for these systems needs to be more evenly distributed through community. So one idea is to, put up a sign like this at a restored site. People can go to a website, find, a little map or a photo to show what was planted and where, and they can go along and indicate whether it's still alive, if it's dead, if it's missing. And in that way, make monitoring into a game that people can do when they're engaged in other activities like camping or hiking. It builds a shared point of reference for people in the community and a shared experience. Another way to do it might be to put up a photo or put up a sign where people can take photos of the restored site. They can upload that to a website, or they could post it to social media with a hashtag. And that could potentially hugely build monitoring capacity and coverage while increasing community involvement and understanding and care for that ecosystem. And it can be accessible. So people that never thought that they could participate in monitoring, as long as they can get to, say, a spot on the dike where there's one of these signs, as long as they can get to that sign, they can take a photo and contribute to monitoring. So I put in a plug for accessibility because my lovely mom, who came out with me to do a lot of my field work, recently had a stroke and uses a wheelchair now. So I'm really interested in finding ways to help people participate and feel a part of restoration projects and communities, even when they can't physically participate in the way that they'd like to. Anyway, that's me. I'm done.
Thank you so much, Kasey. That's a wonderful presentation, and really appreciated your comments on collaboration and engaging with the community. It's really important, and thanks for taking the time to include that in your talk. I also appreciated the focus. Often over here at DFO anyway, we spend a lot of time thinking about salmon, and cottonwood and riparian vegetation is integral to river restoration and understanding. So thanks very much for your really thorough explanations for the value of cottonwoods and how we might think about them in restoration. One of the things you said that really caught my attention was that we don't often report on our failures. And I had a question queued up. I was going to ask if in the work that you do or in the studying that you've done, I was going to ask of the things that you identified as potential beneficial activities for cottonwoods, like dike setbacks, planting, bioengineering. There were a few options you gave to help cottonwood recover. I'm curious if there are some really striking, most successful or most failed examples of where restoration for cottonwood has come across your path, and if you can give us a bit of an explanation for why that happened.
If anything, I've been struck by the scale of failure, which I feel really sad about, having put in a lot of time and effort myself. And the fact that planting projects in particular, like we did some planting projects in collaboration with elementary schools and the Okanagan Center in Penticton, where we had school children come out and plant hundreds of trees. And I think I monitored something like 500 individual trees for that project. And I think about 5 of them survived. It was just devastating. These were people who really cared and who wanted to go back there in 40 years and tell their kids about the tree that they planted. I think we don't know enough yet about how to put these trees back into these highly anthropogenically altered systems that we've created. And of course, as somebody who loves cottonwood, I want everything for them. I want to restore those relationships to the river. But of course, that's wishful thinking. So I think it's really hard to try and envision something in the middle that works. I think that's going to be the challenge. It's really hard to wrap your mind around the need to compromise.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Well, I want to thank you again for taking the time to chat. I believe we have another session at the end for some Q&A. And we do have some questions in the Slido, so we'll come back and chat with you again.